The chandelier light hit the crystal glasses just right as my father raised his champagne flute and said, "Let's celebrate the people who actually belong in this family." And I remember standing there in a navy dress I bought on clearance, realizing every eye in that room had already decided I didn't count. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago, at my parents' 40th anniversary dinner in a country club just outside of Greenwich, Connecticut, I was reminded in front of 30 guests that I was never considered real family. My sister Olivia stood to my father's right, perfect as always, her diamond bracelet catching the light, her smile practiced and effortless, while my mother nodded along like this was just another harmless toast, like the words didn't slice straight through me. I should have expected it. This wasn't new. In our house there were always two versions of everything, two sets of rules, two definitions of worth, and I somehow never qualified for the better one. Growing up, Olivia got the upstairs bedroom with the bay window and the walk-in closet, while I stayed in the smaller room that faced the driveway, the one that filled with cold air every winter no matter how high I turned the heat. When she turned 16, there was a brand new white BMW with a red bow waiting in the driveway. When I turned 16, my father handed me a set of keys to an old sedan and said, "This should be enough for you." Even then, I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself families weren't supposed to be fair, just functional. But there's a difference between being treated differently and being treated like you're temporary, like you're just passing through someone else's life. The first time I heard the words "not real family" wasn't at that anniversary dinner. It was years earlier, in the kitchen, when I was 17 and trying to figure out why my name wasn't included in a college savings account discussion. My father didn't even lower his voice. He just said, "We have to prioritize where it matters," like I wasn't standing 3 feet away. My mother didn't correct him. She just kept stirring her coffee, eyes fixed on the counter like silence could smooth everything over. That moment should have been enough for me to understand my place, but I didn't. I kept trying. I showed up to every holiday, every dinner, every event, always early, always helpful, always hoping that if I just did enough, they'd eventually see me the way they saw her. There was a Thanksgiving where I spent 6 hours cooking, setting the table, coordinating every dish, and when guests arrived, my mother introduced Olivia as our daughter, and me as Emily. She helps out a lot. I laughed it off. I always laughed it off. That was my role. Make it easier for everyone else. Don't make it awkward. Don't ask questions that no one wants to answer. But what I didn't realize then, what I couldn't see yet, was that someone else in that house had been watching all of it. Every comment, every glance, every moment I was quietly pushed to the side. My grandmother, Eleanor Carter, never interrupted, never argued, never defended me out loud. She just watched, her eyes sharp in a way that made people uncomfortable if they looked too long. There was one afternoon about 5 years before that anniversary dinner, when she called me into her study, closed the door behind us, and said something I didn't fully understand at the time. She told me, "Some truths take time, Emily. But when they come out, they don't ask for permission." I thought she was talking about family dynamics, about healing, about things eventually getting better. I didn't know she meant something else entirely. And standing there under that chandelier, listening to my father's voice echo through the room as he made it clear, once again, that I didn't belong, I had no idea that long before that night, before any of us even realized it, a decision had already been made that would change everything about who this family really was. After that dinner, I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I stayed just long enough to not make a scene, smiled at the right moments, helped clear the plates, and left before anyone had to acknowledge that I was gone. The drive back to my apartment took 42 minutes, and I remember every mile because my phone stayed silent the entire time. No message from my mother asking if I got home safe, no apology, not even a follow-up text pretending nothing had happened. That silence was louder than anything my father had said. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of my building, a modest 2-story complex with flickering hallway lights and a rent that took up more of my paycheck than I liked to admit, something in me had shifted in a way I could not undo. I had spent years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I did not belong, and for the first time I stopped asking myself what I could do differently and started asking a much harder question: what if nothing I did would ever be enough? The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because my mind would not slow down, replaying every moment, every comment, every small dismissal I had brushed aside over the years. It was not just the big events, not just the public moments like the anniversary dinner. It was the pattern, the consistency, the way exclusion had been woven into every part of my life so subtly that I had mistaken it for normal. There was the time Olivia had her engagement party at a rooftop venue in Manhattan. 100 guests, live band, catered dinner, and I was asked to arrive 3 hours early to help set up. But when the photographer gathered everyone for family photos, I was told to step aside because they wanted immediate family only. There was Christmas the year before that, when gifts were passed out in the living room, and Olivia unwrapped a designer handbag while I opened a kitchen appliance my mother said would be useful for someone like you. I had smiled, said thank you, and helped clean up wrapping paper afterward like it was just another holiday tradition. And then there were the introductions, always the introductions. Olivia was our daughter, the one who just got promoted, or the one marrying into a great family, while I was Emily. She is still figuring things out, even when I had been working full-time for years, even when I had built a life entirely on my own without a single dollar from them. I used to think if I just reached a certain point, if I achieved something big enough, stable enough, undeniable enough, it would force them to see me differently. But the truth was, they were not measuring me by what I did. They were measuring me by something I was never allowed to be in the first place. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that someone else had always understood that dynamic long before I did. My grandmother never praised Olivia the way everyone else did. She never compared us, never used the same language of potential and investment that my parents relied on. Instead, she asked me questions no one else bothered to ask. About my work, about my plans, about what I wanted, not what I was expected to want. I remember one specific Sunday afternoon at her house, about 4 years ago, when she had me sit with her in the living room, sunlight coming through the tall windows, dust floating in the air like tiny sparks. She handed me a cup of tea and asked me very simply, "Do you feel like you belong here?" I did not answer right away because I had never allowed myself to think about it that directly. I gave her the safe answer, the one I always gave. I said, "Of course it is family." She looked at me for a long moment, longer than was comfortable, and then she nodded slowly like she had just confirmed something she already knew. "Family," she repeated, almost to herself, and then she changed the subject. At the time I thought she was letting it go. I thought she did not want to make things more complicated. What I did not realize was that she had already seen the pattern clearly, already understood the roles everyone was playing, and already made a decision about what should happen when those roles were finally exposed for what they really were. And sitting there in my apartment the morning after that dinner, staring at a life I had built without them, I had no idea that years earlier, while I was still trying to prove I belonged, she had quietly put something into motion that would make that question irrelevant forever. The last time I saw my grandmother before everything changed, she was sitting in the same armchair by the window, the one with the faded blue fabric and the small wooden table beside it where she kept her reading glasses and a neat stack of documents that she never let anyone else touch. And I remember thinking how out of place that stack looked in a house where nothing else was ever left unfinished or out of order. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October, cool enough that the leaves outside had just started to turn, and I had stopped by after work because she had called me the night before, her voice calm but unusually direct when she said, "Come see me tomorrow, Emily. I would like to talk without interruptions." That alone was different because in our family, nothing was ever said without an audience, nothing was ever private unless it was something they did not want acknowledged. When I arrived, the house was quiet, no background noise from the television, no distant sound of my mother on the phone, just the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She did not ask me about my job right away like she usually did not comment on how tired I looked or whether I was eating enough. Instead, she gestured toward the chair across from her, and waited until I sat down before she spoke again. "You have been trying very hard for a long time," she said, her voice steady, not sympathetic, not pitying, just factual. I gave a small smile, the kind I had practiced for years, and said, "That is what you are supposed to do, right?" She tilted her head slightly, studying me in that quiet, deliberate way that always made me feel like she could see past whatever I was saying and straight into what I was not. "Supposed to," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the words, and then she reached over to the table and picked up a single envelope from the top of that stack. It was thick, cream-colored, sealed, with no writing on the outside, and she held it for a moment before placing it back down exactly where it had been. "There are things in this family that were decided long before you understood them," she said, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. "And there are things that can only be corrected in ways people cannot argue with. I did not fully understand what she meant, but I felt something shift in the room, something quiet but permanent, like a door closing somewhere I could not see. I wanted to ask her what she was talking about, whether it had something to do with my parents, with Olivia, with all the unspoken rules that had shaped every part of my life, but before I could, she looked at me again and said, "When the time comes, you will not need to explain yourself to anyone." That sentence stayed with me, even after the conversation moved on to safer topics, even after I left that afternoon and drove back to my apartment, even after weeks passed without anything outwardly changing. Because nothing did change, at least not on the surface. The dinners continued, the same conversations, the same subtle exclusions, the same careful way my presence was acknowledged without ever being valued. And I continued to show up, not because I believed it would make a difference anymore, but because walking away felt like admitting something I was not ready to accept. Then, about 3 months later, I got a call from my mother on a Saturday morning at exactly 8:12 a.m., which was unusual enough on its own that I almost did not answer. Her voice was composed, controlled in a way that told me she had already said whatever she needed to say to everyone else before calling me. "Your grandmother is not doing well," she said, no greeting, no pause, just information delivered like a schedule update. "We are all going to the house. You should come." There was no warmth in the invitation, no sense that my presence mattered, just an expectation that I would fill the role assigned to me, whatever that role was supposed to be that day. I arrived 20 minutes later, the driveway already full, my father's car, Olivia's car, a few others I recognized from extended family gatherings, all parked neatly in a way that suggested this had been organized without me. Inside, the air felt different, quieter, heavier, and as I stepped into the living room, I saw her sitting there again in that same chair. But this time the stack of documents on the table beside her was gone. I noticed that immediately, before anything else, before I even fully registered the expressions on everyone's faces or the way the room seemed to hold its breath, and I did not know why that detail mattered yet, only that it did. And as I moved closer, trying to understand what had already happened without me, I had no idea that whatever had been in that stack, whatever she had been protecting all that time, was no longer where anyone expected it to be, and that absence was about to matter more than anything anyone in that room had ever said about who I was supposed to be. No one said anything when I stepped into the room, but I could feel it immediately, the shift in attention, the subtle recalibration that always happened when I entered a space that had already decided its hierarchy without me, and this time it felt even sharper, like I had walked into something already in motion. My father stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, speaking in a low voice to a man in a gray suit I did not recognize, someone who carried himself with the quiet authority of a professional, not family, not friend, but something else entirely. Olivia was seated on the couch beside my mother, her posture perfect even now, her expression composed in a way that suggested she understood more about what was happening than I did. No one greeted me. No one asked how long it had taken me to get there or whether I had driven safely. I was simply there, another piece in the room, acknowledged but not addressed. I moved closer to my grandmother, and for a moment everything else faded because despite the tension, despite the presence of strangers and the weight in the air, she looked exactly like herself, calm, alert, her eyes clear as they met mine. She reached for my hand, her grip weaker than I remembered but still deliberate, still intentional. "You came," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that felt different. Not relief, not surprise, but confirmation, like she had been expecting this moment to unfold exactly as it was. "Of course," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended, because suddenly it felt like every word in that room carried more meaning than usual. Before I could ask her anything else, my father's voice cut across the space, firm, controlled, the same tone he used in every important conversation, the tone that left no room for disagreement. "Emily," he said, as if just now noticing me, "we are discussing important family matters." I stopped, my hand still resting in my grandmother's, and for a second I thought I might finally say something, finally ask why I had been called here if I was not considered part of what mattered, but the habit of silence came faster than the impulse to speak. "I understand," I said instead, even though I did not. The man in the gray suit glanced in my direction briefly, his expression unreadable, and then returned his attention to my father, who continued as if nothing had been interrupted. Words like assets, distribution, and long-term planning floated through the room, vague but deliberate, pieces of a conversation that clearly had structure and purpose, even if I had not been included in its foundation. My mother nodded occasionally, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while Olivia listened with a slight tilt of her head, the same attentive posture she had always used when she knew she was at the center of something important. I stood there for a few minutes, long enough to confirm what I had already suspected, that whatever was being discussed had been arranged before I arrived, that my presence was not required, only tolerated. My grandmother's hand tightened slightly around mine, just enough for me to notice, and when I looked down at her, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like a signal I did not yet know how to interpret. Then, without raising her voice, without drawing attention, she said something that shifted everything in a way no one else in that room seemed to catch. "Some conversations," she said quietly, her gaze still on me, "are only important because of who is not included." It was not directed at anyone else, not openly, not in a way that could be challenged or corrected, but it landed with a weight that settled somewhere deep in my chest. I wanted to ask her what she meant, whether she was telling me to stay, to leave, to listen more carefully, but before I could find the words, my father cleared his throat and stepped forward, his attention now fully on the group again. "We will finalize everything soon," he said, his tone carrying that familiar sense of conclusion, like decisions had already been made and this was simply the formal acknowledgement of them. Olivia smiled faintly, my mother exhaled like she had been holding her breath, and the man in the gray suit closed his folder with a quiet, decisive motion. And standing there, watching it all unfold without me, I realized something that felt both obvious and impossible at the same time. Whatever they believed they were finalizing, whatever they thought was already decided, it did not include me in any way that mattered to them, and yet somehow, without understanding how or why, I had the distinct feeling that this moment, this exact conversation, was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. After the man in the gray suit closed his folder, the room shifted in a way that felt final, like something had just been decided without ever being spoken out loud in full sentences, and one by one, people began to move again, my mother standing first, smoothing out her dress as if she needed to restore some sense of normalcy, Olivia stepping toward my father with a quiet confidence that told me she already knew exactly where she stood in whatever had just been arranged. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, my grandmother's hand still loosely holding mine, and when I looked down at her, she gave me that same look again, the one that carried more meaning than words, calm but certain, like she had already accounted for every possible outcome. "You should get some rest," I said softly, unsure of what else I was supposed to say in a room where everything important seemed to be happening just outside of my reach. She nodded, but her eyes did not leave mine. "Soon," she replied, her voice steady despite everything. "You will not have to wonder anymore." I did not understand that either, not fully, but something about the way she said it stayed with me as I stepped back and let go of her hand. No one stopped me as I moved toward the door. No one asked me to stay. My father did not even look in my direction, already engaged in another quiet conversation with the man in the suit, their voices low but focused, like they were discussing next steps that did not require my involvement. Olivia glanced at me briefly, just long enough to acknowledge that I was leaving, but there was no expression on her face that suggested it mattered. And just like that, I walked out of the house the same way I had walked into so many moments before, present but unnecessary, included but not considered. The drive home felt different this time. Not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something had finally settled in my mind in a way it never had before. It was not confusion anymore. It was clarity. Whatever my place in that family was supposed to be, it had already been defined without me, and nothing I did now would alter that definition. The next few days passed quietly. No calls, no updates, no messages from my parents about my grandmother's condition, which told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. If something significant happened, I would hear about it eventually, just not directly, not immediately, not as someone who had a right to be informed. I went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, kept my routine intact, but there was a distance in everything I did, like I was moving through a version of my life that no longer felt connected to the place I had spent years trying to belong to. Then 5 days later, on a Thursday morning at 9:06 a.m., my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another automated call or something work-related, but something about the timing made me pause, and I answered it anyway. "Is this Emily Carter?" The voice on the other end asked, calm, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes," I replied, stepping away from my desk and into the hallway outside my office. This is Harold Whitman from Whitman and Associates, he continued, and there was a slight pause after his name, like he expected it to mean something to me, but it did not. I am calling regarding Eleanor Carter. My grip tightened slightly around the phone, my heartbeat picking up in a way I could not control. What about her? I asked, already bracing for the kind of information I knew I was not supposed to receive first. There has been a development, he said, choosing his words carefully, and your presence is required at a meeting this Saturday at 11 a.m. Required. The word stood out immediately, sharp and deliberate, nothing like the vague invitations I had grown used to. I think you may have the wrong person, I said instinctively, because that was how it always worked. Anything important was meant for someone else, not me. There was a brief silence on the line, and then his voice returned, steady, certain. No, Miss Carter, he said. I am quite sure I have the correct person. Your name is specifically listed. I felt something shift again, not the quiet realization I had experienced before, but something sharper, more immediate, like the first crack in a surface that had always seemed solid. Listed where? I asked, my voice lower now, more cautious. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. In a document that was created 25 years ago, he said, and has not been opened until now. For a moment I did not say anything. I just stood there in the hallway, the sounds of the office fading into the background, focusing only on the words I had just heard and the implications they carried, even if I could not fully piece them together yet. 25 years. That was before I could even remember, before any of the dynamics I had spent my life navigating had taken shape in my mind. What kind of document? I finally asked, my voice steady but quiet. And on the other end of the line, without hesitation, without uncertainty, he answered in a way that changed everything about what I thought I understood. A trust, he said, and it names you as a primary party involved. And in that moment, standing alone with a phone pressed to my ear, I realized that whatever had been decided in that house, whatever my family believed was already settled, there was something else, something older, something legally binding that had been waiting all this time, and I had just been pulled into it whether they expected it or not. I did not tell anyone about the call, not that day, not the next, not even when I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, replaying the exact tone of the lawyer's voice and the way he had said my name like it belonged somewhere official, somewhere documented, somewhere that could not be ignored or dismissed with a casual explanation. A trust. The word echoed in my mind with a weight I could not shake, because in my family, trust did not just mean money, it meant control, structure, permanence, something that outlived opinions and arguments and the quiet decisions people made behind closed doors. And somehow my name was in it. I went to work the next day like everything was normal, sat through meetings, answered emails, nodded at the right moments, but my attention kept drifting back to that single detail 25 years ago. That was before Olivia had even been born, before any of the patterns I had spent my life trying to understand had fully formed. Whatever this was, it had existed long before I ever questioned my place in that family. By Friday afternoon, the silence from my parents had stretched long enough to become its own answer. No update about my grandmother, no mention of any meeting, no acknowledgement that anything significant was about to happen. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Whatever this trust was, they either did not know about it, or they did not expect me to be part of it. Saturday morning came faster than I expected. At 10:15 a.m., I was standing outside a glass office building in downtown Stamford, the kind with polished floors, quiet elevators, and a reception desk that made you feel like you needed a reason just to be there. Whitman and Associates was listed in small silver letters beside the entrance, understated but precise, like the kind of place that did not need to advertise what it handled because the people who needed it already knew. I almost turned around twice before walking in, not because I was afraid of what I might hear, but because part of me still believed there had been some kind of mistake, that I would walk into that office and be told they had meant a different Emily Carter, someone with a clearer connection, someone who actually belonged in whatever legal structure this was. The receptionist greeted me politely, checked my name against a list, and then gave a small nod that made my chest tighten before she even spoke. "They are expecting you," she said, as if that alone should make sense. Expecting me. I followed her down a quiet hallway, the sound of my footsteps softened by the carpet, each step feeling more deliberate than the last. When she stopped at a conference room and opened the door, the first thing I saw was my father. He was seated at the long table, his posture rigid, his expression controlled in a way I recognized immediately, the same expression he used when something had not gone according to plan, but he was determined to maintain authority anyway. My mother sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and Olivia was across from them, her usual composure slightly strained, like she was trying to understand a situation that did not fit into the narrative she had always relied on. And then there was the man in the gray suit from earlier in the week, seated at the head of the table, a folder open in front of him, his attention shifting toward me as I stepped inside. No one had told me they would be here. No one had warned me that whatever this meeting was, it was not just about a document, it was about all of us in the same room at the same time, with something that none of them seemed fully prepared to explain. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to register the way my father's eyes flicked toward me, not surprised exactly, but not comfortable either, and then I walked in and took the only empty seat at the table. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, and for a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt different from before, heavier, more contained, like whatever was about to be said could not be undone once it was heard. The man at the head of the table folded his hands together and looked at each of us in turn before finally settling his gaze on me. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm but firm, the kind that did not need to raise itself to be heard. "We are here to address a trust that was established 25 years ago by Eleanor Carter." I felt my breath catch slightly, not because I did not already know that, but because hearing it said out loud in a room where my entire family was present made it real in a way I could not ignore. My father shifted in his seat, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. My mother's fingers tightened. Olivia's eyes moved quickly between the lawyer and me, searching for something she could not quite place. And as the man opened the folder in front of him and began to turn the first page, I realized that whatever had been quietly set into motion all those years ago, whatever my grandmother had prepared without explanation, was no longer hidden, and for the first time in my life, I was not the one standing outside of the conversation, I was at the center of it. The lawyer did not rush, and that was the first thing I noticed, the way he handled the documents in front of him with a kind of deliberate precision that made every second feel longer than it actually was, like he understood that whatever he was about to say would not just be heard, it would be felt. Eleanor Carter established this trust on March 14, 25 years ago. He began, his voice steady, measured, and impossible to interrupt, with specific instructions regarding its activation and distribution. My father shifted again, this time more noticeably, his jaw tightening in a way I had only seen when something was slipping out of his control. "We are aware of my mother's financial planning," he said, cutting in just enough to reassert himself, but the lawyer did not look at him, did not acknowledge the interruption in any meaningful way. "The trust remained sealed until a triggering condition was met," he continued, turning another page. "A condition that has now been fulfilled." There was a pause, brief but heavy, and in that silence, I could feel the tension in the room shift, not toward me yet, but away from the certainty my parents had carried into this meeting. "And what exactly is that condition?" Olivia asked, her voice calm but sharper than usual, like she was trying to regain footing on unfamiliar ground. The lawyer finally looked up, his gaze moving from her to my father, then to my mother, before settling on me again. "The passing of Eleanor Carter," he said simply. My mother inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening further in her lap, and for a moment, everything else faded except that single realization. She was gone. No one had called me. No one had told me. I felt the words before I processed them, a quiet, hollow shift in my chest that did not explode into grief, not yet, because something else was already taking up that space, something heavier, something tied to everything that had led to this moment. "We were going to inform you," my mother said quickly, her voice softer now, almost defensive, but it sounded like an afterthought, like something she felt obligated to say rather than something she had intended to do. I did not respond. I could not. Because the more immediate truth was sitting right in front of me, in a folder held by a man who had just confirmed that whatever my grandmother had set into motion was no longer theoretical. It was active. "As outlined in the trust," he continued, his tone unchanged, "the primary beneficiary designation is not subject to alteration by any external party." My father leaned forward slightly, his hands now flat against the table. Of course not, he said, a controlled edge slipping into his voice. Olivia is aware of her responsibilities. That was the moment everything tilted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that made it impossible to return to what it had been before. Because the lawyer did not nod. He did not agree. He simply turned the page and spoke again. That is not correct, he said, calmly, without emphasis, but the words landed harder than anything else in that room. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Olivia's posture shifted, just slightly, the first crack in the confidence she had carried with her. The trust specifies a single primary heir, he continued, his voice steady, and that designation is clearly stated within the original document. My father's eyes narrowed, his focus sharpening in a way that made the air feel thinner. Then read it, he said, his tone no longer neutral, no longer controlled in the same way. Read exactly what it says. The lawyer did not hesitate. He adjusted the document in front of him, placed one hand lightly on the page, and began to read. Primary heir and sole controlling beneficiary, he said, each word precise, deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. Emily Carter. For a second I did not react. Not because I did not hear it, but because my mind did not immediately accept it as something real, something that applied to me, something that could exist in the same reality where I had spent years being told I did not belong. My name echoed in the room, louder in my head than it had been spoken, and I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me at once. My mother's expression changed first, confusion giving way to something sharper, something searching. Olivia's face went still, completely still, like she had not yet decided how to respond to something that did not fit into any version of the future she had expected. And my father, for the first time in my life, looked at me without certainty, without dismissal, without that quiet assumption that he already knew exactly who I was supposed to be. Because in that moment, in a room where everything had always been decided without me, a document written 25 years earlier had just said something none of them could ignore, none of them could redefine, and none of them could take away. No one spoke for at least 3 seconds after my name was read, and in that silence something irreversible settled into the room, something that did not belong to emotions or opinions but to the kind of truth that exists on paper, signed, witnessed, and legally binding. My father was the first to react, not with shock exactly, but with a controlled disbelief that felt more dangerous because it was deliberate. That is not possible, he said, his voice low but firm, like he was correcting a minor error rather than confronting something that could not be undone. The lawyer did not look up immediately. He simply turned the document slightly as if aligning it more precisely on the table before responding. It is not a matter of possibility, he said calmly. It is a matter of record. My mother shifted beside him, her composure slipping just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. There must be some clarification, she added quickly, her tone softer, more measured, as if she could smooth this into something reasonable. Perhaps a shared designation or a secondary structure. The lawyer shook his head once, a small, definitive motion. There is no ambiguity in the language, he said. The designation is singular. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the document, then on me, then back to the lawyer like she was trying to find a gap in the logic, something she could question, something she could challenge. Then explain it, she said, her voice controlled but tighter now. Explain why her name would be there. That question hung in the air longer than any of the others because for the first time it was not about correcting a detail, it was about confronting a reality that none of them had prepared for. The lawyer glanced at me briefly, then back at the document. The trust includes an attached letter from Eleanor Carter, he said, his tone unchanged, to be read only upon activation. My father exhaled slowly, a sound that carried both frustration and restraint. Then read it, he said again, more forcefully this time. If there is an explanation, we will hear it now. The lawyer reached into the folder and removed a separate sheet, slightly different in texture, handwritten rather than typed, the ink dark and steady across the page. For a moment he did not read it. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked down, as if confirming something one last time, and then he began. To my family, he read, his voice steady, each word landing with quiet precision. If you are hearing this, then I am no longer there to explain myself, which means I must trust that what I have written will be enough. I felt my chest tighten, not with panic but with recognition, because even without hearing the rest, I knew this was her voice, her way of speaking, direct but measured, never wasting words. For years I have watched how value is assigned in this family, the letter continued. Not by character, not by integrity, but by convenience and perception. My mother's posture stiffened. Olivia's expression hardened slightly. My father did not move at all. There is one among you, the lawyer read, who has been treated as if she were temporary, as if her place could be questioned, adjusted, or removed entirely depending on what suited the moment. I felt every word land, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something I had lived without ever hearing it acknowledged. That was never acceptable to me, the letter continued. But I understood that words alone would not change what had already been decided. The lawyer paused briefly, just long enough for the weight of that sentence to settle, and then continued. So I chose a method that cannot be dismissed, reinterpreted, or ignored. My father's jaw tightened again, his focus now entirely fixed on the page in front of the lawyer. This trust, he read, was created to ensure that the person who was treated as if she did not belong would be placed in a position where belonging is no longer subject to anyone else's definition. I felt something shift inside me, not sudden, not overwhelming but steady, like a foundation being placed where there had never been one before. Emily, the lawyer read, his voice softening just slightly as he spoke my name. You were never the outsider. You were simply surrounded by people who did not recognize your place. This is not a gift. It is a correction. No one interrupted. No one challenged it. Because for the first time, the narrative that had shaped everything in that room was being rewritten in a way that no one there had the authority to stop. The room did not return to normal after the letter ended, because there was no version of normal left that could contain what had just been said, and for the first time, no one reached for a quick explanation or a polite dismissal. My father leaned back slowly in his chair, not in relaxation, but in recalculation, like he was trying to rebuild a structure in his mind that had just been taken apart piece by piece. This is an interpretation, he said finally, his voice controlled again but thinner now, stretched over something he could not quite contain. A personal statement does not override the broader structure of family responsibility. The lawyer did not respond immediately, and that silence carried more authority than any argument. The statement clarifies intent, he said at last, and the legal structure enforces it. My mother turned slightly toward me then, her expression searching in a way I had never seen before, like she was looking for a version of me that matched what had just been described, something she could recognize, something she could align with the person she believed she had raised. Emily, she said, her voice softer than it had been all morning, you understand that this changes things for everyone. I held her gaze for a moment, and for the first time, I did not feel the instinct to soften my response or adjust my tone to make it easier for her. It already did, I said, quietly but clearly. Olivia shifted in her seat, her composure returning in layers, like she was putting something back together piece by piece. We need to be practical, she said, her tone steady, measured, the same tone she had used in every situation where she expected to be the one guiding the outcome. If this is accurate, then there are responsibilities attached, decisions that affect the entire family. This cannot be treated as a personal correction. I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but because the language felt familiar, the same language that had been used to justify every imbalance, every decision that had never included me. It was never treated as personal before, I said, my voice calm, not raised, not emotional, just direct. The lawyer turned another page in the document, his attention returning to the structure rather than the reactions. There are specific provisions, he said, including control over designated assets, voting authority in related entities, and final decision-making power in matters outlined within the trust. My father's eyes sharpened again, this time not with disbelief, but with focus, the kind that came when he recognized something he understood, something he could engage with on his terms. Then those provisions must be reviewed carefully, he said, his tone regaining some of its earlier firmness. We will need to ensure that the execution aligns with the best interests of the family as a whole. There it was again, the phrase that had always defined everything, the best interests of the family, a concept that had never included me until now. I felt the weight of it settle differently this time, not as something I needed to earn or interpret, but as something that no longer applied in the same way. The execution aligns with the document, the lawyer replied, his voice even. And the document is clear. My mother looked between us, her uncertainty growing more visible with each exchange, like she was trying to find a place to stand that did not shift beneath her. We just need time to understand this, she said, almost to herself. I understood that feeling more than she realized. I had spent years trying to understand something that had never been explained to me, trying to find logic in patterns that had been decided long before I had the language to question them. The difference was, now there was something that did not require interpretation, something that existed outside of perception and preference. The lawyer closed the folder again, not abruptly, but with a finality that signaled the end of explanation and the beginning of consequence. Copies will be provided, he said, looking at each of us in turn. Implementation will proceed according to the terms outlined. No one objected. Not because they agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue. I looked at the table, at the space in front of me that had always been empty in conversations like this, and for the first time it did not feel like absence. It felt like something had been placed there, something solid, something that could not be removed simply because it made someone uncomfortable. And as I sat there in a room that had spent years defining me without my input, I realized that whatever came next would not be about proving anything, not to them, not to anyone, because the proof had already been written, signed, and sealed long before I ever knew I would need it. The meeting did not end with resolution, only with acknowledgement, and as we stood up from the table one by one, it was clear that no one knew exactly how to move forward from something that could not be undone or negotiated. My father was the first to leave the room, not abruptly, but with a measured pace that suggested control even where it no longer fully existed, his mind already shifting toward strategy, toward structure, toward how something like this could be managed rather than denied. My mother followed a few steps behind him, her expression distant, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of reality at once, the one she had lived in for years and the one that had just been placed in front of her without warning. Olivia remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the closed folder in front of the lawyer, as if staring at it long enough might change what was inside, might reveal some overlooked detail that would return things to the version she understood. When she finally stood, her movements were precise, controlled, but there was a hesitation there that I had never seen before, a fraction of a second where certainty had been replaced by calculation. I stayed where I was until the room had mostly cleared, not because I needed more information, but because I needed a moment to exist in that space without being defined by anyone else in it. The lawyer gathered the documents carefully, placing each page back into the folder with the same deliberate precision he had shown from the beginning. "You handled that well," he said, not looking up at first, as if the statement was simply part of the process, not a personal observation. I was not sure how to respond to that because I had not felt like I was handling anything. I had simply been present in a moment that did not require my input to change everything. "I did not do anything," I said after a pause. He looked up then, his expression neutral but not distant. "Exactly," he replied, and there was something in that answer that settled more deeply than I expected. I left the building a few minutes later, stepping out into the late morning light, the air cooler than I remembered, or maybe just clearer in a way that made everything feel sharper. For a long time I had measured my place in that family by what I was allowed to participate in, what I was included in, what I was told I deserved. But standing there on the sidewalk, watching people move past me with their own routines, their own concerns, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. Not in how they saw me, not yet, but in how that perception mattered. My phone buzzed in my hand before I even reached my car, and for a brief second I considered ignoring it, but the name on the screen made me pause. My father. I stared at it for a moment, the weight of everything that had just happened still settling into place, and then I answered. "Emily," he said, his voice controlled again, familiar but different in a way I could not ignore. "We need to talk about what comes next." I leaned against the side of my car, the metal cool against my arm, and looked out across the parking lot. "What comes next has already been outlined," I said, my voice steady, not confrontational, just clear. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that used to make me fill the space with explanations, with adjustments, with anything that would make the conversation easier. This time I let it sit. "That is not how this works," he said finally, the edge returning, but softer now, less certain. "These things require coordination, Agreement. I thought about that, about all the times coordination had been used to exclude, agreement had been assumed without my involvement, and for the first time the pattern felt visible from the outside rather than something I was caught inside of. It already worked, I replied. You just were not part of the decision. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again there was something underneath the control, something closer to recognition than resistance. We will discuss this further, he said. And the words sounded less like a directive and more like an acknowledgement that the conversation had changed in a way he could not fully guide. I am sure we will, I said, and ended the call before the instinct to soften it could take over. I stood there for a moment longer, the phone still in my hand, the world around me moving at its usual pace, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was trying to catch up to something I had been left out of. I felt like I was standing at the center of something that had been set in motion long before I understood it, something that did not require me to prove where I belonged, because that question had already been answered in a way no one else could redefine. The next few days did not explode into chaos the way I might have expected, but that was almost more unsettling, because everything on the surface looked the same while something underneath had shifted permanently. My phone, which had stayed mostly silent for years unless I reached out first, began to light up in ways it never had before, not constantly, not dramatically, but enough to feel intentional. My mother called the next morning, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, careful, measured, like she was stepping into unfamiliar territory. We were thinking of having dinner, she said, as if it were a casual suggestion, as if we had not just sat in a room where everything she believed about our family had been quietly rewritten. Just us. No guests. I knew what that meant. It was not about dinner. It was about control, about bringing the conversation back into a space where roles could be reestablished, where tone and setting could soften what had been made official. I have work, I replied, not as an excuse, but as a boundary I had never set before. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Of course, she said, recovering quickly, but the shift was there. The assumption that I would adjust had been replaced by the realization that I might not. Olivia texted later that afternoon, a message that read more like a business email than anything resembling a sister. She suggested we meet, said it would be productive to align expectations moving forward. And for a moment I stared at the words, recognizing the language immediately. It was the same language she had always used to define outcomes before anyone else could question them. I did not respond right away. Not because I did not know what to say, but because for the first time I understood that I did not have to respond on her timeline. By the time I did reply, hours later, my answer was simple. We can talk when it is necessary. No explanation. No adjustment. Just a statement. That evening I sat in my apartment, the same space that had once felt like a temporary stop in a life I was trying to prove, and realized how different it felt now. Nothing had changed physically. The same worn couch, the same small kitchen, the same stack of unpaid bills on the counter. But the weight attached to it was gone, the quiet pressure that had always been there, the sense that I was building something that would only matter if it was recognized by someone else. I thought about my grandmother then, about the way she had watched everything without interrupting, the way she had chosen not to argue within a system she knew would not change, and instead built something outside of it entirely. That was the part one had not understood before. She had not tried to fix the family. She had made it irrelevant to the outcome. 2 days later I received a package at my door, a simple envelope with no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandmother's. My hands hesitated for a moment before opening it, not out of fear, but out of the awareness that whatever was inside had been meant for a version of me she believed I would become, not the version I had been when she wrote it. Inside was a single letter, folded carefully, the paper slightly thicker than standard, the ink steady and deliberate across the page. I sat down before reading it, the room quiet around me, and unfolded it slowly. Emily. It began, no introduction, no explanation, just my name, the same way she had always spoken to me, directly, without assumption. If you are reading this, then you have already heard what the others needed to hear. But there are things you need to understand that are not written in legal language. I felt my breath slow as I read, every word landing with the same clarity her voice had always carried. They will try to reframe this, the letter continued, to make it about responsibility, about fairness, about what is best for everyone. But you must remember, Fairness was never their standard. It was convenience. I paused there, not because I needed to, but because the truth of it was so precise it felt like something being set into place. You are not responsible for maintaining a structure that excluded you, she wrote. You are only responsible for what you choose to build from here. I lowered the letter slightly, the words settling into something deeper than reaction, something closer to direction. And sitting there in that quiet apartment, with her handwriting in my hands and the echo of everything that had just changed still moving through my life, I realized that what came next was not about proving anything to them anymore. It was about deciding what I would no longer accept, and what I would finally allow myself to become without asking for permission. The next decision did not come from pressure or urgency or even expectation. It came from something quieter, something that had been building long before the meeting, long before the letter, something that finally had space to exist without being pushed aside. 3 days after I read my grandmother's letter, I found myself driving back to the house I had spent most of my life trying to belong to. Not because anyone had asked me to, not because there was something left unresolved, but because there was something I needed to see clearly, without the noise of their voices shaping what it meant. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, the same white exterior, the same perfectly trimmed hedges, the same driveway where everything had always been arranged with quiet precision, like appearance alone could define what existed inside. I parked at the edge instead of pulling all the way in, a small choice, but one that felt deliberate, like I was no longer stepping into the same role I had always played. When I walked up to the front door and knocked, it took longer than usual for someone to answer, and when my mother finally opened it, there was a brief moment where she seemed unsure of how to greet me, like she was trying to decide which version of our relationship applied now. Emily, she said, her voice careful, controlled but softer than before. We did not know you were coming. I nodded slightly. I know, I replied, and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation that had never truly been extended. The house felt different, not physically, but in the way silence settled into it, the absence of assumption replacing the quiet certainty that had always defined every room. My father was in the living room, standing near the window, his posture straight, his attention shifting toward me as I entered, and for the first time there was no immediate dismissal in his expression, no quick categorization that placed me somewhere predictable. Olivia was there too, seated on the couch, her posture composed but her eyes more alert than usual, like she was anticipating something she could not fully control. No one spoke at first, and I realized that the silence was not empty, it was waiting, not for me to fill it the way I always had, but for something else entirely. I came to talk, I said finally, my voice steady, not raised, not defensive, just clear. My father nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words he had offered me in years. Then talk, he said, his tone measured, but without the authority it once held so easily. I looked at each of them for a moment, not searching for approval, not waiting for a reaction, but simply recognizing what had been and what no longer applied. I am not here to negotiate the trust, I said, the words deliberate, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. I am not here to align expectations or redefine roles. Olivia shifted slightly, her composure tightening, but she did not interrupt. I am here because for the first time I understand something clearly, I continued. This was never about me proving I belonged. It was about all of you deciding I did not. My mother's expression changed, something flickering across her face that looked like recognition, or maybe regret, but I did not stop to define it. And now, I said, that decision does not apply anymore. The words did not echo, did not create a dramatic reaction, but they settled into the room in a way that could not be ignored, the same way the letter had, the same way the document had, something that existed outside of emotion and could not be reshaped by it. My father exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on me, and for a moment, I saw something I had never seen before, not weakness, not defeat, but the absence of certainty, the realization that whatever framework he had relied on no longer held the same authority. You are still part of this family, my mother said quietly, the words careful, like she was offering something she believed mattered. I held her gaze for a second, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. That was never yours to decide, I replied, and for the first time the statement did not feel like defiance, it felt like fact. No one argued. No one corrected me. Because for once there was nothing left that could be reinterpreted. And as I stood there, in a house that had shaped so much of who I thought I had to be, I realized that I was no longer standing inside something I was trying to earn. I was standing at the edge of something I could choose to walk away from or redefine entirely on my own terms. When I walked out of that house, I did not look back, not because I was trying to prove something, but because for the first time, there was nothing behind me that needed to be checked, no reaction I needed to measure, no expression I needed to interpret to understand where I stood. The air outside felt different, clearer in a way that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the absence of something that had followed me for years, that quiet, constant question of whether I was enough, whether I belonged, whether I could eventually earn a place that had always been conditional. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not rushing to leave, not trying to hold on to anything either, just allowing the stillness to exist without filling it with doubt. My phone buzzed once in the passenger seat, then again, then a third time, messages stacking up in a way that would have pulled my attention immediately just a week ago, but now I let them sit. I already knew what they would say, variations of the same thing, attempts to reframe what had happened into something manageable, something that could be discussed, adjusted, negotiated back into a version that felt familiar to them. But this was not something that could be adjusted. It was not a conversation that could be softened or redirected. It was a foundation that had already been set, long before any of us had the chance to question it. I started the car and pulled out of the driveway slowly, passing the same rows of hedges, the same carefully maintained lawn, the same house that had always represented something I thought I had to work toward, something I had to fit into. And as it disappeared behind me in the rearview mirror, I realized that it no longer held the same meaning. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The following weeks did not unfold with dramatic confrontations or sudden reconciliations. Instead, they settled into something quieter, something more deliberate. Documents were transferred, meetings were scheduled, decisions were made, but this time I was not waiting to be included. I was already there. The lawyer guided me through everything with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning, explaining structures, outlining responsibilities, not as something overwhelming, but as something that had been prepared carefully, intentionally, with the expectation that I would be capable of handling it. And that expectation felt different from anything I had experienced before, not because it was new, but because it had always existed somewhere, just not in the places I had been looking. My parents reached out more than they ever had, calls, messages, invitations framed carefully, as if they were learning a new language they were not entirely comfortable speaking. Olivia adjusted too, her tone shifting from certainty to strategy, her words more measured, more aware, like she was recalibrating a dynamic that no longer placed her at the center by default. And through all of it, I did not feel the need to respond the way I used to. I did not rush to fix the tension, did not try to smooth over what had been revealed, did not step back into a role that no longer fit. Instead, I listened when it mattered, spoke when it was necessary, and allowed silence when there was nothing left to explain. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I returned to my grandmother's house alone. The rooms were quiet, the same sunlight filtering through the windows, the same chair by the window where she had sat, the place where everything had been observed long before it was understood. I walked through slowly, not searching for anything specific, just taking in the space as it was, without the weight of expectation attached to it. When I reached the study, I paused for a moment before stepping inside, the memory of that stack of documents still clear in my mind. The table was empty now, the surface clean, but I knew what had been there, what had been set in motion long before I had the awareness to recognize it. I sat in the chair across from where she used to sit and let the silence settle around me. Not heavy, not unresolved, just present. It worked, I said quietly, not because I expected an answer, but because the truth of it felt complete in a way that did not require confirmation. And as I sat there, in a space that had once held so many unspoken observations, I understood something fully for the first time. This was never about replacing one position with another, never about moving from the outside to the center of something that had already been defined. It was about stepping out of a system that had never been built for me in the first place, and into something that had been prepared differently, something that did not ask me to prove my place because it had already been written in a way no one else could erase. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.